Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from License Oak, Introduction to IBM Licensing. If you're interested in IBM licensing, then you're in the right place. We'll be covering it, getting into it today, and I'm going to make the screen a little bit bigger and myself a little bit smaller. Hi, my name is Pierce MacDonald, and I am your presenter today. So without further ado, let us get into today's presentation. So what we'll be covering, short enough agenda. We're going to be doing some short introduction to myself and what we do. Then the majority of it will be spent on today's topic, which is IBM Sub Capacity Licensing, which is a very, very important topic really within IBM licensing, not the least of which it's probably where you can both save a fortune and lose a fortune. So that's what the majority of this will be covering. And also there will be a Q&A section at the end, and based on previous webinars, that can kind of be a free-for-all. So you can do the Ask Me Anything with regard to IBM licensing, and I will do my best. So with regard to the webinar itself, before we start, the webinar is available on demand, so don't panic if you have to leave early. You can catch up on it. And attendees have been muted, just because easier to manage these things. But also, I do want you to chat away in the chat box and put your comments, questions, and you can also help each other if you've got some input you can do. With regard to questions, if you put those in the question section, I will try and get through those either during the webinar itself or at the end. So whatever questions you have there, feel free to raise them at any stage. Don't save them all up. So to get us started and get our fingers moving, we're going to have our first poll of the day. So give me a moment as I click on the poll, and you're about to make it published. So basically this poll is, what option best describes your role? Procurement, software asset management, on the technical side with IT architecture and infrastructure, or more on the InfoSec side, or other. So click your buttons and make your selection. Now, so the numbers are coming through. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds for it for you to make your votes. Give me a moment. Let's see. Oh, some of you can't see the question. It should be up there right now. I was a bit slow pulling the trigger. Let's see what we got now. I'll give you a quick summary on the results. Most of you are coming in at software asset managers. There's a few others. I'm surprised there isn't too many from the IT architects and infrastructure side. That's okay. So right now, the SAM guys are winning. So there'll be another poll later, which you've probably already gotten an early view of. So what are we covering today? So our agenda, introductions, IBM licensing, and Q&A. So the introductions. Who am I? My name is Pierce MacDonald, and I'm from License Oak, and we're independent IBM license experts. And I guess my story is I spent the last 10 years or so in IT asset management. At this point, probably having done hundreds of projects relating to software asset management, the majority of which are basically helping clients to pay less and get more for their investment. And also, I would call myself an expert in IBM licensing, but that wasn't always the case. It turns out that they don't teach IBM licensing in college, or at least not the one I was in. And so I had to do a lot of research, spending a lot of time on the IBM websites. I also had to ask a lot of questions from various experts over the years, anyone that I met, conferences and so forth. And of course, there's nothing like the lessons learned from doing lots of audits, ELA renewals, and optimization projects. What this comes up to is that essentially I'm taking this information and I want to make it easier for people to get at as well. So hence I'm running this series of webinars and to share my knowledge. So when I'm not doing webinars and SAM projects, I'm writing about it or talking about it. If any of you follow me on LinkedIn, you will see that I put posts up there, usually around IT asset management, also up on our blog on License Hawk. And when I'm not talking about it, I lead the ITAM.org chapter here in Ireland, and I contribute on the 19770 ISO standard. That's a little bit about me. Then a little bit about License Hawk. And basically, in simple terms, we're a team of independent license consultants who focus exclusively on IBM licensing. And our mission is simple: to help organizations get more value from their investment in IBM technologies. And we cover distributed, mainframe, and cloud. Now, most of this introductory webinar series is covering distributed, but if there's enough interest, we certainly would like to talk about mainframe, which is very, very expensive, although quite niche, and of course, cloud, which is the new kid on the block. And in terms of services, well, we're quite simple, really. How we help is, are you getting the audit letter? I think which most of us are aware of, but also the pre-audit letters. Where there's an uncertainty around compliance, we provide service in that area. And ELA, preparing for that, evaluating and helping to get people to, I guess, companies to buy a better deal. And then once they've got that, configuration, implementation of the SAM tools, most notably ILMT, and we do a little bit of training, and of course these webinars. So that's enough about us, I think. Let us get into the main topic we want to cover today. That is IBM Sub Capacity Licensing. Now I'm just going to take a peep over into the chat and just see if there's any questions coming through. I think we're all okay. And let me just scroll down there. So, and someone's laughing at my jokes. Okay. Before we jump in here, I have another poll for you. I want to understand and get an idea of how would you rate your knowledge of IBM licensing? This can be simple enough. Are you brand new to IBM licensing? Have you some experience, as in maybe you've been doing it for a few months, maybe not had to do your first ELP yet, but are working with it? Are you experienced, as in been doing it a couple of years? Maybe you've been through an ELA, or finally expert. This might be where all the wannabe auditors are hiding, or the consultants in the audience. Make your selection, and let's see what we've got, shall we? So right now I'm looking over there, and we have an interesting mix. Majority of you are new to it, or with some experience. We have a couple of experts in the audience as well. I love your confidence. Feel free to help out the others in the audience when questions come in that you think you might have the better answer for. I might even come asking you myself. So back to it. So sub-capacity licensing. Really what we're going to cover here is, I'm going to start off with some background around the licensing. We're going to a little bit of agreement. Don't glaze over. Won't be too boring. We're going to have a little look at the tools and the reporting, which is probably where it comes to sub-capacity licensing is critical. It really is where the battle is won and lost. Looking at some examples, because there's nothing like seeing money and the scenarios played out and case studies. And indeed, these are examples you can take away yourselves if you need to build a business case. We'll take a look at common mistakes. There are a lot of them, but there's a few which can be common and which are high impact. And then I'll touch on some resources at the end. So without further ado, IBM Sub Capacity Licensing. The quote you're looking at there is straight out of the IBM website. IBM Sub Capacity Licensing lets you license an eligible software product for less than the full capacity of your server and group of servers. So there's a few words in that sentence, but this is the definition that IBM have on it, and that's what matters. Like many things, though, the wording does give you a little bit of flexibility. Now, it's useful to understand where sub-capacity licensing sits in the agreement stack. Now, don't worry, the slide in front of you looks quite busy. This came from the first webinar in our series where we talked about how the agreements are stacked. I won't spend too much time here other than to say you have your base agreements, which are IPLA, International Program License Agreement, LI, License Information, which has its policies. And then you have the commercial agreements. Most of you are familiar with Passport Advantage or Passport Advantage Express. And this is where subcapacity licensing and subcapacity terms come in. It is a commercial agreement, money. And that has a different focus than from an IP or an assignment, which is the lower level agreements. So within here, you have subcapacity licensing. And the thing about subcapacity licensing, and indeed all of the addendums and policies that IBM add on, is that they are virtual. They are living documents. They change. They change. The subcapacity licensing only changed this year, which we'll get into later. But be aware that this is how they stack, and it's a document online, and it's well worth your time looking it up. I'll point you to it later. Interestingly, you have ELA agreements and then the larger SO and SSO agreements that are on top of that. They can actually override some of the statements within subcapacity licensing, the most common of which is, do you even need to report subcapacity? If you're spending enough, IBM will cut you some slack. Or indeed, they may give you credit with regard to maybe you don't have to implement the measurement tools exactly as the rest of us normally would. But that's you doing your spending many, many millions. So subcapacity licensing, it is within the commercial agreements, and it is one of the dynamic documents living online. So we'll move on from there. So within subcapacity licensing, really you've got 5 areas of eligibility that you want to be looking at. Are the products eligible? For the most part, they are actually. There's very few products that are not eligible for subcapacity licensing. Possibly some of the MQ products running on HP infrastructure. But for the most part, all the products are. And but if you're unsure, there is a document online, and that will guide you. Then you have, is it ineligible metrics? And subcapacity licensing is essentially narrowed down to processor-based license metrics. And what I mean by that is PVU, RVU, sometimes socket, sometimes processor-based, depending on. Is it an eligible virtualization technology? Now, in fairness, pretty much every technology is. There is a document that lists it. But what is interesting is that sometimes operating systems can make a technology ineligible, most notably the Windows 2008, which was extended due to a bit of an outcry from the larger organizations. But from time to time, certain technologies do fall out of eligibility. There's a document worth a look once a year. Is it an eligible processor technology? For the most part, they are. There is a document again. You'll hear me say a document. IBM are very good like that. They're very transparent in their licensing. Unfortunately, you have to go find the document. The majority of processor technologies are indeed covered. The only, I guess, exceptions within this would be multi-threading, where you have to be a little bit extra careful. And the final area, which is quite contentious, is the eligible license measurement tools. What tools are allowed to actually do the measurement, and more importantly, return the reports. The thing about it here is that all of these criteria must be met. Otherwise, it switches to full capacity. And but don't worry, it's not for the entire estate. It is just for the individual product and for the individual server on which you have deployed. It's a subtle but important point to understand here. Subcapacity comes down to the server deployment. You'll remember my definition at the very beginning. Okay. It's worth looking now at the tools. Oh, thank you, Orla, by the way, for posting up that link online for part 1. It's not on Livestorm yet, guys. It will be. It'll be up on YouTube shortly. So it's on YouTube now. It will be over on Livestorm on my own channel quite soon. So, eligible measurement tools. For all the talk in the market, there's only three. There is IBM's ILMT, which they haven't divested to HCL. They have retained the ILMT bit. There's Big Fix, which has been divested to HCL, and there's Flexera. These are the only tools, despite the rest of the measurement and management tools that are out there, that will be accepted by IBM for the licensed measurement and reporting of subcapacity. Now, lots of tools take feeds from ILMT, Big Fix, and Flexera. Plenty of examples, most notably, I guess, would be Aspera, ServiceNow, and so forth. But when it comes to subcapacity reporting, in other words, complying with the rules, it must be these three tools. As a side note, even Flexera, you must receive explicit sign-off from IBM before they will accept subcapacity from Flexera as well, because they wish to inspect and ensure that the implementation complies. So the three tools. And the reason really it's such a limited number is that it is very, very complex. And it is also a moving target, as in there is frequent updates and changes to license metrics, to the various policies I discussed there, and capturing those from a technology standpoint is quite challenging and quite difficult. And as you might expect, IBM have narrowed it down to these tools. So once you've got your tools, do we always need tools? Actually, not always. There are a few exceptions. They can be simply put, either you don't want to virtualize, you don't wish to use subcapacity, which is fine, then you don't need to have ILMT deployed, and you don't want to take advantage of subcapacity. If you do want to take advantage of subcapacity, generally you need to either be a small organization or have a small footprint of IBM products. So the first one is, if IBM do not support the virtualization environment, and as I mentioned, there's very few of those. Next up is if your organization has fewer than 1,000 employees, which does include contractors and permanent, and the capacity of the servers that IBM has deployed on is less than 1,000 PVU. That ain't a whole lot, I'll be honest. 1,000 PVU of pretty much any product is probably one node in an ESX cluster. Or you just decided, I'm just going full capacity licensing. I don't want to take advantage of capacity. Therefore, you're not obliged to run any tools as far as IBM is concerned. It is important to remember, though, you must comply with the 2-year retention. They must have the records. But don't worry, they do help by providing you with a worksheet. You can find this one online, as always. Rather than put in the hyperlink, just Google manual calculation of virtualization capacity. You will get the official spreadsheet. It's quite an old one, and it does need to be maintained. And I would be strongly advising that you get help completing this the first time around. Very easy to make mistakes and will take quite a bit of time. But once you've got it, your environment isn't changing so much, you have it. You just need to check it once a year to make sure that no changes have occurred. So get help when it comes to manually preparing it the first time, and then after that, give it an eye once a year should be fine for you. But back to those that are going to be when it comes to reporting on things. So when it comes to reporting requirements, you've got 4 core elements, and within that is a few things. So the first thing is you have to have ILMT or an equivalent tool deployed. And from 99% of you, it's going to be ILMT. This is a free tool from IBM, or when I say free, you must purchase it, but at 0 cost, which is subtly different when it comes to Password Advantage. It must be installed and configured within 90 days. And this one can catch out a lot of people. It's a typical one that I find in license reviews and audits. If you're, for example, doing a physical to virtual transformation, you need to have deployed ILMT, and it needs to have been fully configured, and the hardware, the migration needs to be completed in 90 days. If it hasn't, you basically need to negotiate with IBM for an extension. If you have done it in the 90 days, great. You've now ticked the first box, which is you have an up and running and fully configured installation of ILMT. Second bit, you're generating quarterly reports. You're going to need to maintain 2 years worth or 8 of these. The actual report itself is called the ILMT audit snapshot. It's actually 12 reports in a zip file, but essentially it contains the information you'll need when it comes to, first of all, understanding yourself. And I do strongly recommend you review these before you go archiving them off or sending them to IBM. But it'll contain all the information that is required by IBM to track your usage and to grant you the subcapacity benefits. Next, you need to have 2 years worth, and these need to be 8 quarterly reports going back 2 years. Yes, if you have a few missing, you might be able to get away with it, but you are potentially at a risk there. And also, do look at the content of them. There's no point keeping 8 quarters worth of reports if they're containing essentially information that you are out of compliance. It might seem obvious, but there's no point keeping some of this information if you're hugely out of compliance. Correct and check before you send them in. And you must be able to make them available to IBM at request, and that could be at any point, or in the event of an audit, in which case it's no longer optional. Now, if you don't hit these 4 major areas, then you're out of compliance, and the automatic position is you revert back to full capacity. That's something to keep in mind here. You might think you're doing well and fantastic, but if you don't hit these 4 high-level criteria, you don't qualify for sub capacity licensing. Okay. Moving along. There's nothing like an example to walk you through this, and I've prepared 2 here, and I didn't want to go into too much detail because it's quite difficult sometimes without going into spreadsheets to really show the value. And what I'm trying to convey here is both the positive and the negative of subcapacity. So let's jump in. First scenario, it's a typical one. The product here is WASND. To be honest, it could be anything that's got a PVU metric or a processor-based metric. In our example, we have got a nice 9-node cluster and running a typical enough configuration, Intel Xeons, quad cores, which altogether give us 72 cores of licensable cores. They're available. Remember that definition from earlier? On this, our organization has deployed 105 virtual machines. To be honest, it's irrelevant how many they've deployed. What's actually important is 10 of these virtual machines are running WASND, had them installed, and they've been assigned or allocated 1 virtual PVU each. So what are the numbers? Well, in this scenario here, if you'd gone full capacity, all 72 cores, that's 70 PVU for an Intel processor at a cost of $184 list, you're looking at about just over $900,000 of a cost. Now, in this case here, because they have implemented and fully comply from a subcapacity point of view, they have dramatically reduced that cost, that demand in licenses from 72 down to 10 cores worth. Again, at 70 PVU, which brings us in at just over $128,000. Now, that's a huge saving. But I want you to also think about this another way. What happens if this had gone the other direction? In other words, that we had subcapacity licensing and we, for some reason, failed to comply with the reporting requirements, or the tool wasn't working, or the tool we had wasn't compliant, any of the reasons that it failed, what was a $128,000 cost could suddenly become a $900,000 cost. Now you can see why it's so important, first of all, to understand what's happening from a subcapacity licensing point of view, but also to be watching it, because it is the single greatest area for compliance risk within IBM licensing. The subcapacity rules, they might have been in compliance at the start of the project and maybe in the first year, but over time they have fallen out of compliance because they have not met the reporting requirements. I've just been asked there to explain again more briefly the 10 cores for subcapacity rather than the 72 cores. So we have our cluster, and it's got 9 physical servers, 2 Intel Xeon chips, quad core 4 gives us our 72 cores. Now we have deployed WASND on 10. We've created 10 virtual machines, each with WASND deployed. because it's 10 with one virtual CPU each. That's where the 10 comes from, but only if we have sub-capacity licensing implemented. So rather than the 72 you have to license, which is full capacity, we can license the 10 cores, which is the sub-capacity. I hope that explained it a little better. But I also hope you're getting the point here that the sub-capacity rules can cut both ways. You can make huge savings or you can create a huge risk. The next example, again, is a common one, which is actually a remedial action we'd recommend very often when we find a problem. And this is where you have a scenario where somebody was in full capacity and they want to bring it to sub-capacity. Or more precisely, that they basically had the problem I just mentioned. Their sub-capacity is not compliant, in which case, in this case here, we've actually broken off and created a separate farm B. So rather than all 8 ESX hosts, we've separated one out and we've moved all of the 10 virtual machines over to that one VM farm B. Now what you've had is an interesting situation. You've 10 virtual machines all in one place, sitting in one ESX host, running your WAS-ND with one virtual CPU each. What's changed here, though, is interesting, because full capacity is, in this case here, $103,000, but sub-capacity is the same. Why? Physically, there are 8 cores on this machine. Even though we've assigned 10 virtual CPUs, IBM will only require licenses for the physical core limit of that machine. So in this case here, both the virtual and the physical are the same. What's also interesting here, though, is this is a very common remedial action. If you find that essentially, rather than deploying IBM products into a huge cluster, in this case here we had 9, they've created 2, and they've moved the products, in this case the WAS-ND, into its own dedicated node. And this is compliant and is a very common way of fixing subcapacity problems. It's also a very common way of reducing the PVU demand later, because you can constrain and you can essentially over provision on the virtual cluster without incurring a higher license cost. I hope I didn't confuse you with that. Okay, so that's those worked examples. Again, it can go both ways. You can make huge savings or you can make huge risks. Can you imagine a situation where if that particular VMware in the VMware farm B was moved into the cluster A, what was probably fully license compliant previously now suddenly becomes a huge compliance risk for the organization. And the most common example of this is physical to virtual transformation projects, where people move items from a dedicated physical server over to a VMware configuration or data center, and now they've created this huge license risk. Okay. At this point here, I did want to just comment on a definition of active processor as IBM sees it. And it's just something to be aware of, because you'll hear us constantly talking about PVU and cores and active processors. An active processor core is a processor core that is available. Keep that word in mind. It does not have to be used for use in a physical or virtual server, regardless of whether the capacity of the processor core can be or is limited through virtualization technologies, OS commands, BIOS settings, or similar restrictions. What they're basically saying here is, the likes of live migrations or some of the VMware configuration, the Affinity rules, that's fine. But if you move them into the clusters and you do not have subcapacity licensing in place, you are liable for the full license. Okay. It's not enough to just have soft rules if you use the cores, if they're available to you. Remember that key phrase, available. Okay. A quick comment here on subcapacity measurement. And these are kind of some of the questions that have been posed to me over time. A common one is, what's the maximum? So I go, the maximum processor cores assigned to a partition. So remember our example, even though we had provisioned 10 virtual cores, it's actually the max that's available on the partition or the SX node. In that case, it was 8. It's the max available to the physical host. So if you over provision in your cluster, It doesn't matter. It's the maximum available. An interesting one, though, is the high water mark. And this is essentially the case, and this is something that ILMT and the SAM tools will track. Basically, if they move around or if you increased and reduced over time, it is the high water mark that is taken. So if you have deployed, even for a very short period of time, onto, let's say, 10 or 20 cores, that is the number that you must be fully licensed for the 12-month period. The clock does not reset until your new SNS period. So even though you might reduce back the cores quickly, you're still required to buy licenses for that increase. And IBM, unlike Microsoft, do not allow true up. You got to buy it immediately. And it may be the case that you're over licensed in the new period. That's a separate conversation. And also, if there are ever any problems with ILMT, or indeed with your quarterly reports, you're liable for the full capacity licensing. Now, it's only going to be on the physical server you have the product deployed on, but keep that in mind. At any point, you are potentially liable. Now, in an audit situation or a license review situation, you may be able to negotiate out of it or come to an agreement or demonstrate that was a momentary lapse. But keep in mind, you have the risk there. That's something to be aware of always. If you don't comply to the rules and your SAM tool, ILMT being the most common, is not fully compliant, you got a risk. And as we've shown you, quite a high risk. Okay. So a little bit of a delay. So last bit here is going to be the common mistakes. And the most common ones really here when it comes to subcapacity licensing is you just don't have the 2 years of audit snapshots. Or if they are, the snapshots themselves are incomplete, or they actually show you as being out of compliance. So have you got the snapshots? Can you put your hand on them is a simple question to ask. If you cannot, then you are out of compliance, and that is a significant risk for you. The other one is ILMT has not been deployed at all, or it's been poorly configured. And sorry if some of you are losing me, by the way. I see I'm getting a message here telling me there's a comms problem. I'll keep going. ILMT not being deployed properly or configured correctly. This is at the very beginning. I find this a very common one, particularly where it's an in-house implementation, because implementing ILMT is complex. It is not enough just to install it onto a machine and hope for the best. It does require very specific configuration, most notably that it requires external access to update portals on the IBM side. Once it's installed, another very common mistake is ILMT is not maintained. ILMT is a monthly maintenance job. You have to make sure you're not on the old versions, that the fixes are being coming down, not just being downloaded, but that they're actually being deployed as well, because it's not enough for them just to be downloaded. You do actually need to put them in, you need to release them into the environment as well. There's also PVUs and signatures being out of date. The most common cause of this is changes in firewalls, or them being downloaded but not actually imported into ILMT. Another one which is less obvious is sometimes they're just not agents on the machines, but there is an IBM product. Now, if there's no IBM product on the machine, you do not need to have an agent on it. Although, to be honest, you're better off having agents on them anyway. They have a very light footprint. They're not very chatty. They won't cause a problem. Or the agent might be there but hasn't reported in a long time. Now, putting aside that the machine could be decommissioned, the most common cause of this is firewalling, or the machines being moved or DMZ'd. Either way, you must account for all these machines, and they're very common mistakes, and all it takes is one for a very significant increase in costs to hit you. So, in terms of some resources, IBM are actually quite good at posting information on their website. type in subcapacity definition and you'll be brought to the official subcapacity licensing page. There's also a very good FAQ that's well worth a click. There's of course YouTube. There's not only the License Talk channel, but there's others as well. Although I, at this point here, would ask you to go over and subscribe. I'd click the link here, but I'm afraid I might lose the screen. So if somebody else can paste up the latest the YouTube channel link, I think actually I saw it there, or let's put it in. If you subscribe, you'll get this update, including the webinar we're working on. Latest version of ILMT, yes, I think it is 19.2. The sub number you don't have to worry so much about. It's the major and minor release. The sub number is only, to be honest with you, it's the patching that you need to be most aware of there, and the fixlets, that they are absolutely current, because, and they should be as on the month. So as long as you're on the 9.2 and that you are getting your signatures and patch down the fixlet patches, you're okay. Just as an aside, other resources, we actually have a couple of guides on our page. Just go to the resources page. There's a good one there on ILMT for health checking, and the webinars. We also have, we will have a few of those accumulating over time. So that's, I guess, ILMT subcapacity. Well, it's mainly subcapacity. We will be doing a dedicated webinar on ILMT coming up soon, because it's a common area. And even if you're not technical and you're not the ones who are going to be the sysadmin for these things, you need to know how that console works. You need to know what to look for and what to check for as SAM professionals when it comes to licensing. So at this stage here, I am going to jump into the question box and see what has been asked. Please let loose. I'm here to answer your questions as best I can. So top one here. Hopefully the comms stay good. So Tracy's saying, should ILMT be installed on every server, or should the organization, regardless of their IBM software, installed or not? So fair question. It does not. ILMT, first of all, is only installed on, well, it's on one main machine, which is your database, and then ILMT itself is the dashboard, which can be run on pretty much any Windows machine. The agents are the thing that's most important. I would say that the agents must be deployed onto any server that you wish to take advantage of subcapacity licensing. But I would be strongly recommending that it's deployed onto all servers on which you have IBM software deployed, mainly so that you can see what's happening. And you can see it in the ILMT console. You do not want to be getting surprises in an audit where you're suddenly discovering IBM products deployed on servers you did not know about. So that's, hopefully that answers that question. And as a general rule, though, I would also say that if you have a large environment, you can deploy the agents onto other servers. But it's a judgment call for you. Your administration team may not be keen on deploying agents onto machines that do not have IBM products installed. So I got AJ here asking, is licensing should be calculated on the peak processor? I'm guessing what you mean there, AJ, is the high water mark. So essentially, when you deploy the products, and let's assume you're going for subcapacity and you're working properly, it is going to be the maximum number of processors or virtual cores used in the period. So you might have assigned 5, you've assigned 4 to it, but for whatever reason you increased it to 6 because it was end of quarter or a billing period or something like that. It is the high watermark that you need to be concerned about. It's the 6 that that IBM will be expecting you to have licenses for. Next question I got here is the what is the frequency what frequency does IBM compliance audits or software review for subcapacity licensing? Well, first of all, you have an informal one. Is if you're using subcapacity licensing, you must have quarterly reports, because whether they come into you 1 year or 10 years, they will expect to see 2 years worth of reports available. So you have essentially an internal audit occurring literally on a quarterly basis. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, because if you hand up those reports and there's a compliance risk in there, you're essentially incriminating yourself. So that's the first thing. Typically, though, from our experience in the audit world, you're looking at between 2 and 3 years. There's a very good page, if you look to the blog, on what triggers an IBM license audit. Actually, if I believe one of the webinars on the YouTube channel actually covers it as well. What are the top 10 triggers for IBM license audits? But to answer your question simply, it's around the 2.5 to 3 year mark, or if there's been a significant change in your organization, or something else triggers it. So about 3 years, if nothing else changed. But usually there is a trigger. Something causes it. Just look along here then. Should we, just give me a moment. How should we calculate IBM Sub Capacity Licensing for third-party integrated software such as VMware and SAP? Okay, a couple of caveats here. First of all, VMware is essentially the virtualization technology. So all of the rules I have there around sub-capacity licensing apply. In fact, VMware is the most common platform on which sub-capacity licensing rules, and of course ILMT, which does the measuring, is used. But with regard to SAP, there's a caveat there, because that is one of those ones where now by default, if you're deploying SAP onto IBM Frame, it's not typically through IBM. It's not the products are not bought from IBM, so hence they do not qualify for sub-capacity licensing. And very often also, if you're deploying them on the hardware, it's the infrastructure you're concerned with. And the last thing is, it is almost always covered by some sort of an either embedded license or an ASL type agreement as well. So it gets a little bit complicated when you've got bundled solutions or third-party solutions included. So that'll be a separate one to take offline probably. Have we other questions now? I'm just wondering. Just give me a moment. I switch across to the chat and see what we've got coming out there. So I've got big long question here at the moment. If a few machines fail the scan or missing scan, is that an issue? It's not an issue so long as you fix it before the quarterly report. And this is why I'm saying that maintaining ILMT, and which is the measurement tool here, is a monthly thing, not a quarterly thing. You want to find these failures, fix them before you run the audit report. So you mind it on a monthly basis, you run your reports on a quarterly basis. And that's also why before you run those quarterly reports, check to see if there's any obvious failures, if there's anything that's missing from the list, because part of that report will include any agents that have not reported in, and it very clearly will highlight it. It also highlights it on the dashboard. It literally is in your face. You can't avoid it. So very often though, you might find that the failed reports could be the machine is decommissioned and it can be taken out of scope, or some other reason they can be taken out of scope. But if you don't fix the problem, the assumption by an auditor or IBM will be that you must have the licensing cores. You must have the agents reporting in, and they're in scope. Now I see an update coming through there from Orla. Thank you very much. I'll have to double check on the requirements around 2000 PVU. What I'll do actually is I'll clarify that one and send out an update. So it could indeed be that my information is out of date. Thank you very much for that one, Orla. And so we also, maybe ILMT may request for the previous 12 months, I may request you license the additional 1000 PVUs. So it's a very good answer there from Orla. Let me switch across now to the questions again. High watermark is one that will commonly catch you out. There is a sense that, I've got subcapacity, I've got 8 cores worth, I'm licensed, but you miss the fact that maybe you are out of time. that you've had a burst and you need to license for that if you do. I'm just looking along here now. Is there any other one? I think we're okay on that one. Okay, so I think we have reached most of the questions from the channel at the moment. I hope I'm coming through to you loud and clear, because I am getting the odd message telling me there's comms issues. I'm just taking a scan up the questions, see if anything else has come into the channel in the last few moments. If there are no more questions, I will be proposing that we finish up this webinar. But before I do, I have an ask. It's an easy one. So just give me a moment and I do this, pop up the slide. First of all, thank you. But I have another presentation coming up at Wisdom Online, the ITEM review, and I will be speaking at 3 p.m. on the Wednesday. And it's actually going to be a very good presentation because I've been working on this one. It's focused on cost savings, in particular focus on scenarios where you can reduce your S&S. That's your subscription and support and subscription costs as you come to a year end. And I go through 10 examples of things to think about that may help you to bring down those numbers. So it's 3 p.m. on Wednesday. Wisdom Online is a 3-day online conference. Is well worth checking out anyway. And get on over there and register. Other than that, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. I hope you found it useful. If you did, say nice things on LinkedIn and your friends. And I will be sharing a link, as I said, after this for the on-demand version. So I'm just one last look in the question box. By the way, if you've come up with some questions afterwards, just email them over to info@licensedhawk.com and I'll happily answer them for you. Okay, thank you very much for your time, everyone, and bye.